The Prime Minister today praised the Air India pilots and crew members, including doctors who flew across to Wuhan in China to evacuate 600-odd Indians from the epicenter of the novel coronavirus outbreak. Mr. Modi has issued a letter of appreciation to the team members of the evacuation operations. This letter is being handed over to the crew by the Minister of State for Civil Aviation. As the coronavirus spreads in so many regions, particularly across different parts of China, it's important to reflect on the fantastic operation led by Air India in bringing back to India several hundred Indian nationals from the Wuhan region. Joining us now, the executive commander of the operations into Wuhan. He's also the director of operations of Air India, Captain Amitabh Singh, one of the senior most flyers in India, I would say probably across Asia or anywhere in the world at this stage. Thanks so very much for being with us.
Thank you.
You know, we were chatting before we started this interview, and you mentioned that when you reached out to Air India crew members, there wasn't a single no. Everybody said, yes, let's go. How did that work?
So, I wouldn't say I was surprised. It was expected because Air India and the Air Indians have been involved in a lot of evacuations over the past few years. In fact, I was just informed that one of the first evacuations was in 1948.
Right.
And we've been involved in a lot of evacuations in 1990 onwards. So when we were told that we need to evacuate some of our Indian students and others from Wuhan, so we called out to our pilots, cabin crew, and other staff like commercial staff and engineering, and they all said yes. Right. So I'm not very surprised, but it was expected.
But they would have had concerns about when they came back, right, with their families in quarantine. So how did that work? What were some of the questions or queries?
Yes, concerns were there, rightly so. And not for themselves as much as for their families, especially for people who have small children. Right. So we were able to satisfy all their questions with Dr. Gupta from Ram Manohar Lohia.
Who traveled with you there?
He traveled all the way to Wuhan and back with his team, and must compliment him the way he conducted the whole flight. And so he was able to give all the do's, the don'ts, and so-called misplaced fears about this coronavirus.
Yeah.
And he was able to satisfy them.
Right.
And we were informed that once we come back, since we're going to be well protected, we would be under a 7-day self-quarantine, home quarantine, and to keep interaction with the family to the minimum.
Right. And were you all tested as well for the coronavirus? Or
after landing into Delhi, our aircraft was taken to a isolated bay.
Right.
Where there was ITB and the doctor teams and everyone was there. So we were checked for temperature before we were let off.
Right. Yeah. And so far everybody is fine. There is no concern.
Absolutely
or
nothing
like
at all.
So that went. And I think that goes to show how carefully you had to organize, the flight itself, the fact that you were wearing these hazmat suits. And you were telling me something very interesting about how there were different compartments of the aircraft for specific purposes. This was not your usual commercial flight by any means.
Absolutely.
How did that work? Just tell us how you structured the aircraft inside.
Okay, so once it was decided as to what the team is going to be, so we were going to be having pilots, cabin crew, commercial staff, engineering staff, and doctors. Most important were the doctors. So it was decided once we came on board that the passengers would be segregated and kept in the economy section. We have about 370 odd seats there. The doctors and the engineers and the support staff would be in the first class. The rest of the support staff, including cabin crew, would be in the upper deck, is the executive class.
So you wanted to keep some distance between?
Absolutely. We wanted to keep them as separated as possible. And all the cabin crew and the doctors who were going to be in the lower floor and interacting with the passengers were in their protective suits all the time. They were down there.
And the pilots in the cockpit and the engineers and others, whoever was in that area, they were cut off, right? They didn't really exit the cockpit until such time as they wore those hazmat. You can't fly with that on.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's very restrictive. So what we had decided was that the pilots remain in the cockpit. They would be out only for physiological requirements, otherwise remain in the cockpit. And if they did come out once or twice, was with the mask, the gloves, and the the glasses.
Right. And the other interesting point that we were talking about is that those who were quote unquote or relatively exposed on the aero bridge, when they came inside the aircraft, they got a fresh set of hazmat suits, right? They replaced their
So on doctor's advice, what we were doing was the doctors, support staff, and the cabin crew who were interacting with the passengers before takeoff were wearing a set of suits. Once we were airborne, then they could come out of their suits, but they were not allowed to go into the economy section.
Right.
But before landing, especially the cabin crew had to be there that man the doors in case of an emergency evacuation after landing. So they were told to wear a fresh set of suits as abundant precaution, as part of abundant precaution.
And food parcels, water, everything was pre-positioned, and you or one of the pilots would have told the passengers that this is not a normal service flight. You know, you won't be getting beverages.
It was a no-frills flight.
Right.
And we wanted to keep minimal interaction between our cabin crew for their safety and the passengers. So I did make those announcements before departure. And the food was pre-packed, the water was given, and we had kept lots and lots of bottles. We were carrying maybe nearly over 1,000 bottles of 1 liter bottled water for the passengers, and they were kept in the galleys for them to be able to help themselves if required.
I must ask you this before we go on with some of these other fascinating details. A lot of these passengers must have been so relieved to see all of you. They must have said thank you, and they would have really meant it. I mean, considering the situation they were in, they must have been scared.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, when we were landing into Wuhan, it was under complete lockdown. So it was going into a dead city. All the lights were on, and the street lights were on. The buildings were well lit, but not a soul, not a vehicle anywhere. And these students and other passengers, other citizens of India, they were all contained in a certain area, either in their hostels or in their offices, and they were allowed to travel in buses only once a flight departed India to the Indian consulate in Wuhan.
Right.
So when they came, obviously they were worried, they were scared, you could see that. And there was a sigh of relief when they got on board, especially once we got airborne. So there was a lot of clapping, there was a lot of relief. Oh yes, of course. And I think all of them were thanking the country and the airline.
Yeah. Yes. And now, Captain, you've done this before as well. I believe you were part of those world record evacuations in the 90s, Iraq. Right?
Yes.
So this is something that Air India does, and at one level this is something that you've been very closely involved with as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
So yes, I was a young first officer way back in 1990 when I did my first evacuations.
You're not old now.
And yes, as an Air Indian, as a citizen of this country, I have been involved in a lot of evacuations. Air India has been involved in a lot of these evacuations. It's been a sense of pride with which we've gone and done it, especially because Air India, we've always considered ourselves as the second line of defense. Yeah. And we've always risen up to the requirements and been there every time. Unique about this particular evacuation was, I think, if my memory serves me right, first time we were doing a medical evacuation of this scale. And it was worrisome because we wanted to go in and get out, keeping everyone safe, the passengers and our crew.
Right. The second flight, things started going wrong. There was a cracked windshield and things like that. What happened?
Okay, I wouldn't say anything was going wrong. It's a mechanical issue, really. So on the return, we had one of our windshields crack, but we are well trained for that. And so we came into Delhi.
It didn't shatter, it cracked.
Well, the right word is shattered.
Right.
So it has 4 to 5 layers. So the outer layer had shattered. So we were very safe. And so we continued to Delhi, as was the correct decision. And of course, keeping the safety of the passengers in mind. And we did an auto land, it was successful.
Yeah, so there was nothing beyond that. I mean, it wasn't anything more concerning. Something else which I learned about was before your first flight, you were fueled in the aircraft or just waiting to take off and you still didn't know whether you had a go, no go.
Yes.
It went right down to the wire before
Yes.
you got. How soon before the flight did you actually take off?
So
Did you know?
12:50 was our scheduled departure because the Chinese authorities wanted us to land after 8 o'clock in the evening in Wuhan. So we had calculated backwards. So 12:50 was the first departure time. And yes, so we came to know just about 5 to 6 minutes before door close that we are good to go. Right. So by the time we closed our doors and we got a pushback clearance, I think we were airborne within 12 minutes of our scheduled departure time, which is very good.
Yeah. And the aircraft you operated, the Boeing 747-400, the jumbo, couldn't be a more perfect aircraft for an operation like this. I mean, you've done evacuations on jumbos in the past as well.
Oh, yes. See, it's been a workhorse for Air India, and by the very fact that the capacity, it serves the purpose. Right. And the second is 4 engines. That supports us. So yes, it has been a boon for us.
It would have been heartbreaking though for you crew members to know that 6 odd people in the first flight couldn't actually board. But that was not a decision that you took or the doctors on board took. It was taken by Chinese authorities.
Yeah, we had no control. In fact, what we were informed is that once the passengers, the people we were evacuating, reached the airport, after the check-in, they have a 3-tier scan.
Right.
Only once they clear those 3 medical scans are they allowed to board the aircraft. And before boarding, our own doctors were checking them for temperature and giving them a full brief on the do's and the don'ts, including how to wear a mask and the hygiene. Yes, it was, I'm sure disappointing. I wish we could have got everyone back. But overall safety of the other passengers and everyone, I think it was a good decision by the authorities.
Yeah. And as soon as you landed, all of the passengers on board were taken into quarantine in Manesar or one other place in Delhi, run by the ITBP. So people were told about this on the flight, or did they know where they were headed before?
Yes, I made that announcement that after landing, you would be taken to various areas which would be quarantined, and the final brief would be given by the authorities after landing. So they were aware of it. In fact, if I remember correctly, on the second flight we were told that the women and children would be sitting in front, and they would be deboarded first. Okay. And on the same flight, on the second flight, 30 males were asked to get off first because they were being sent to, I think, Manesar first. Right. But that was some logic issues were being worked out by the authorities, which we were not aware of.
Right. Well, Captain, your last month in Air India, it's been quite something, being involved not just across the entire fleet, but also in these operations and the ones in Wuhan. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us. Thank you very much indeed. Well, there you have it, Captain Amitabh Singh, telling us, sharing lots of details for the first time on how Air India pilots were actually involved in this operation. And for me, what really strikes is that first line that he mentioned, that when the crew members were told, you have to go, would you like to? They said, absolutely, there's no question of saying no. It reflects the spirit of the airline. It's back to the studio.